The fighting scene back in the arcades typically consisted of two games. You had Street Fighter 2 and Pit Fighter. I'm joking. The other one was, of course, Mortal Kombat. Two games that took the fighting genre in two separate directions. Street Fighter taking more of a lighthearted animated look at the fighting genre, whereas Mortal Kombat tried to get darker, grimmer, more gory. Come 1994, a third arcade game came out, Killer Instinct, and this sort of tried to bridge the gap between the two. I always thought it was sort of the happy medium between violence and sort of cartoony action. And if you had a Super Nintendo, you might have been lucky enough to actually play it. But people with the Genesis, the closest thing you got was Eternal Champions. Now the basic premise of the game is this. The karmic balance between good and evil has slightly shifted in evil's favor. Now the Eternal Champion, some sort of cosmic entity, has the power to allow one of your characters to affect the change and bring good back into balance. The catch? Each of the characters are dead, and Eternal Champion can only bring one back to life. So you're basically kicking each other's faces in, hoping that you do well enough to save the world. Or, at the very least, make it a slightly less horrible place to live in. As a fighting game, I'm surprised it actually got that much of a plot, so, you know, props to having a story there, Eternal Champion. What really surprised me is the fact that they actually have in-depth written details about each and every one of the characters, from their fighting style to where they came from, their time period, and potentially what they could do to affect change in the world. Although I immediately have to take offense to this because a fishman from 110 BC apparently is a master of Brazilian capoeira. I'm starting to doubt the factual accuracy of this documentary a little bit. But overall, this game has a lot of backstory for its characters if you care to read them. And if you're big into fighting games, I'm not sure why you would be, but you know, it's there. The gameplay itself is a little bit of a mixed bag. You've got a relatively decent sized roster, for the time anyway. And each character is at least a little bit different. You've got a ninja girl, you've got a fish man, you've got a caveman, you've got a gangster, which is kind of neat. But the characters themselves are goofy and fun, and I think there's at least enough to give you one character you can at least associate with, even if it's the bad Blade knockoff that is literally named Blade. Yeah, I don't know how the people who made this game didn't get sued. The overall gameplay itself is full of many options, starting from training mode, practice mode, various different settings you can have, from different stage hazards to AI difficulty, although weirdly enough you cannot affect the AI difficulty for the standard competition, which is a bit odd, but you can do it for individual matchups, so as long as you're not too hung up on seeing an ending for this game, you can still enjoy it no matter what your skill level is. Like, seriously, I could not win a single match of the standard campaign mode, but even someone as wildly inept at fighting games as I am managed to win a few times on this slightly modified version. Now, gameplay wise, one of the biggest problems I have with this game are the controls, because they're a little bit nonsensical. Alright, so we all know I'm inept at fighting games and have never been able to pull off a special move in my life. I'm willing to admit that. But at least something like Street Fighter, it makes sense, where all the moves are based on standard attack inputs and a rotation of the joystick. That makes sense. Or say Mortal Kombat, which was a couple directional inputs and then a basic attack. Again, it makes sense, although this style feels like it was made more for a controller. Eternal Champions, however, is a little bit different, usually requiring you to hold a direction for a small period of time, then release, then a certain button combination. So hold back for half a second, let go, and then press A and B. So it feels kind of nonsensical coming off of any other fighting game ever, even as someone who's awful at them in pretty much every regard. Now, going back to my introduction of how this sort of compared to a median between Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, the two biggest names out there at the time, you have these sort of cheesy, cartoony characters, the cavemen, the fishmen, the sorcerer guy for whatever reason, but the somewhat exaggerated look of the characters is contrasted by the brutality in this game. Alright, so the standard combat itself isn't too bad for the most part. Sometimes there's some blood, sometimes not. But this game, like Mortal Kombat, has fatalities. although they make absolutely no sense for being in here. And I'm not saying that because they contrast with the style. I mean, for no logistical reason other than the fact that Mortal Kombat had them, are they here. First of all, the fatalities in this game have nothing to do with your characters. They are entirely stage-driven. But that's okay, Mortal Kombat did that too, that's fine. But where this game's fatalities differ from Mortal Kombat's is the fact that Mortal Kombat's required you to understand your character. It required you to understand the special inputs required to pull off a fatality, whereas this one does not. Instead, fatalities are triggered by damaging your opponent and having both you and your opponent stand in a specific spot each on each stage. Now, of course, I don't think I need to say this, but fatalities existed as one final punch to your opponent saying, yeah, I kicked your ass this hard and I managed to look awesome doing it. It was a good way to rub your opponent's nose in the fact that you managed to beat them. Eternal Champions, however, because you don't have to understand what you're doing to do it, and it's entirely based on where you're standing, it really doesn't require any sort of set amount of skill, so much as it does luck. And on the base level, that sounds bad, but the way this game does it, the positioning is so precise that even after reading up guides on where you have to go to make these stage fatalities happen, even after being able to set up the specific conditions repeatedly, I think I managed to get it to work maybe twice in an hour of trying. So yeah, it's highly unlikely it's going to happen, and it's terribly random, and it defeats the entire purpose of fatalities, so why they're here, I don't really know, other than the fact that they're trying to compete with Mortal Kombat. But despite the overall mediocre gameplay, the presentation of this game is actually pretty damn good. The visual aesthetic is quite nice, the characters have tons and tons of personality. The only thing about the visual presentation I don't like is that it feels like it's trying to be too detailed. And I know that sounds weird, but it feels like every bit of the environment is trying to pack so much detail in that nowadays, especially on larger TVs, just makes everything look super pixelated. But that said, it does have a decent range of environments, including a lava level. I have to give you props to that, because lava level in a fighting game, awesome. The audible presentation is also quite good. I think this game utilizes the Genesis sound chip quite expertly. So yeah, in the end, presentation, really well done, despite the fact that the game it's trying to present isn't exactly top tier. That's pretty much Eternal Champions. It's an okay fighting game that has rather odd design choices gameplay-wise, but weirdly enough, it managed to do well enough to get a sequel on the Sega CD, which I've heard is actually really good, as well as 2 spin-off games which I've heard are complete and utter garbage. But this game managed to sit in between those two extremes.